James Caldwell sat alone in his dimly lit apartment, the hum of the refrigerator echoing through the emptiness. The walls, lined with books he never read and framed photographs of a past life, seemed to close in on him. He poured himself another glass of whiskey, his hand trembling slightly as he lifted the bottle. At 40, divorced for nearly 3 years, James felt the weight of every lonely evening pressing against his chest, a pressure that left him restless and raw. Nights like this, he turned to the only escape left, the screen of his laptop. It was on one of these late nights that he met Lily Monroe. She was 22, vibrant, teasingly mysterious, with photos that seemed to promise warmth he hadn't felt in years. Their first messages were innocuous, a joke, a question about music, but each reply, each carefully chosen emoji, pulled him deeper. She had a way of making him feel seen, of leaning into his vulnerabilities without giving away too much. He couldn't explain why, but something about her words pierced through the protective walls he had built around himself. James' days became structured around her online presence. Every alert, every scene, notification sent a thrill through him, or a pang of fear when she didn't reply quickly enough. He reread her messages multiple times, memorizing the way she phrased herself, the subtle gaps between her words. His friends noticed the obsession growing, the way he ignored calls, skipped lunches, and muttered to himself when checking his phone. But James didn't care. He believed this was more than fascination, it was destiny. In the middle of a restless Thursday, he impulsively booked a flight to Florida. It was irrational, reckless, and terrifying, but the thought of finally meeting Lily in person ignited a manic energy inside him. He told himself it was necessary, a test of courage, but underneath that justification lay a raw, unacknowledged need to possess, to control, to confirm the fantasy he had built in his mind. The week leading up to the trip was a blur of preparation and obsession. James studied her social media, analyzing every post for hidden meanings. He noted her favorite cafes, the park where she walked her dog, the streets she mentioned passing. Each detail became a thread he intended to follow, a map leading to the center of his desire. Even as doubts pricked at the edge of his mind, was this obsession? Was he crossing a line? He silenced them. Desire was louder than reason, and the lure of her presence drowned the warnings. On the night before departure, he sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the boarding pass in his hand. His apartment smelled faintly of alcohol and stale coffee, the shadows from the lamp stretching across the walls like silent watchers. He imagined her greeting him at the airport, her smile, the brush of her hand against his. A pang of fear twisted in his stomach, a whisper of consequence he refused to heed. Obsession, he realized, was a dangerous thing. It consumed, it demanded, but it was also intoxicating, and he was ready to surrender entirely. As the plane ascended over the city the next morning, James pressed his forehead against the cold window, watching the world shrink below him. Every mile toward Florida was a mile deeper into his own mind, a tunnel of desire and dread intertwined. He didn't know exactly what awaited him at the end of this journey, but one thing was certain, nothing would ever feel the same again. The obsession had begun, and with it, the first steps toward a world that promised desire, danger, and darkness. James Caldwell stepped off the plane, Florida's humid air immediately clinging to his skin. The faint scent of salt from the nearby coast mixed with exhaust fumes and the sweet tang of blooming flowers. He tugged his suitcase through the bustling terminal, his heart hammering not from exertion but from anticipation. Every passenger he passed blurred into a background, insignificant compared to the one person he had come to see, Lily. The taxi ride to her apartment was a study in sensory overload. Neon signs flickered along the streets, palm trees swayed in the breeze, and laughter and music spilled from crowded cafes. Yet James felt detached, consumed by the mental rehearsal of their meeting. His mind raced with imagined scenarios. She would smile, he would smile back, everything falling into the precise perfection he had dreamed of. A small, irrational fear tugged at him, the worry that reality would fail to match fantasy, but he shoved it aside. Desire, raw and unrelenting, had overridden reason. When he arrived at Lily's building, a modest apartment complex tucked between pastel-painted condos, He lingered outside for a moment. The sun reflected off the windows, casting sharp, golden beams across the cracked pavement. James adjusted his shirt, took a deep breath, and walked up the worn steps. Each one creaked under his weight, sounding louder than it should, as if the building itself sensed the tension in the air. The door swung open before he could knock. Lily stood there, hair slightly tousled, a mischievous smirk curling at the edges of her lips. "James," she said, her voice both soft and commanding, "you made it." His chest tightened. The reality of her presence struck him with a force he hadn't anticipated. She looked smaller than he imagined, but no less intoxicating. There was an intensity in her gaze, a flicker of something unreadable that made him both exhilarated and uneasy. Inside, the apartment smelled faintly of citrus and candle smoke, with a lingering undertone of something he couldn't place. Lily guided him to the living room, where sunlight filtered through gauzy curtains, painting everything in a soft, golden hue. James noticed small details: the stack of unread letters on the table, the faint stains on the carpet, the cracked frame of a mirror, and for a brief moment, a whisper of doubt flickered in his mind. But it was quickly drowned by the surge of desire that had brought him here. Their conversation started awkwardly, small talk that seemed trivial against the weight of anticipation. Lily laughed, touched his arm lightly, and questioned him about the journey. "Was the flight terrible?" she asked, teasing. James nodded, voice caught somewhere between relief and anxiety. He was aware of every nuance, her posture, her tone, the slight hesitation in her eyes, and he catalogued it all, building his own narrative of connection. Later, as they sat on the balcony watching the sun dip below the horizon, James felt a strange mixture of exhilaration and unease. Florida's warm breeze carried the scent of saltwater and exhaust, the distant hum of traffic blending with the rhythmic pulse of his own heartbeat. He tried to focus on the moment, but subtle inconsistencies gnawed at him. A story she told that didn't match her social media post, a laugh that seemed forced, a glance she quickly diverted. By the time night fell, James knew he was caught in something far more complex than desire. Lily was intoxicating, yes, but also unpredictable, her moods flickering like candle flames in the wind. And while the city around them sparkled with neon promise, James realized he had entered a world where every step forward was shadowed by tension and uncertainty. As he lay in the guest room that night, the distant sound of traffic outside his window mingled with the memory of her gaze. He understood something vital. The paradise he had come to find was not a place, nor a person. It was a volatile, living tension, and he was already caught in its pull. Tomorrow, he thought, he would begin to see the cracks in the fantasy. The morning sun slanted through the thin curtains, painting Lily's apartment in sharp, golden lines. James Caldwell sat on the edge of the bed, staring at his hands as if they might offer answers to questions he hadn't yet dared to ask. He had arrived in Florida with a carefully constructed fantasy of intimacy and control, but the reality of Lily's presence was far more unpredictable than he had imagined. Already, he sensed the first subtle fractures in his vision. Lily appeared in the doorway, hair damp from a quick shower, wrapped loosely in a towel. "Morning," she said, her voice airy yet distant. James smiled, trying to mask the tension twisting in his chest. He wanted to believe everything was perfect, that the months of longing and obsession had led to this singular, ideal moment. But as she spoke, his mind picked up on small inconsistencies, slight hesitations, half smiles that didn't reach her eyes, words that didn't quite align with the photos and messages he had memorized. Breakfast was a quiet affair. Lily buttered toast with deliberate care, humming a tune James didn't recognize. He tried to engage her in conversation, probing gently about her friends and daily life. Each response, while seemingly innocuous, felt calculated, evasive. "I haven't seen them much lately," she said, and then quickly added, "but it's fine. I like my space." There was a pause in her tone, a flicker of guardedness that set James' nerves on edge. He forced a laugh, though it felt hollow, the first ripple of doubt echoing through him. By mid-afternoon, James ventured into the city alone. He wandered along the streets lined with pastel buildings and bustling cafes, yet even amidst the vibrancy, he felt the invisible chains of his obsession tightening. Every glance at his phone was a desperate attempt to decode Lily's silence. Every message he imagined sending was a rehearsal for confrontation, connection, or confession. The fantasy he had brought with him was beginning to collide with the unpredictability of the real person in front of him. Returning to the apartment, James found Lily on the balcony, phone in hand, her expression unreadable. "Hey," he called softly, hoping for warmth. She looked up briefly, smiled faintly, then returned to her screen. The slight dismissal, subtle as it was, stabbed at him with a mix of frustration and fear. He realized that the Lily he had idealized, playful, eager, attentive, was not fully accessible to him. She was a living, breathing person with moods, secrets, and desires of her own. As evening approached, they sat together on the couch, silence stretching between them like a taut wire. James tried to initiate conversation, to bridge the growing emotional distance, but she deflected, laughing lightly at jokes he barely understood. "You worry too much," she said, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. But James couldn't shake the creeping sense that he had entered a game he didn't fully understand, one where the rules were hidden and the consequences unknown. That night, he lay in the guest room, listening to the city hum beyond the window, and replayed every interaction. The inconsistencies, the small evasions, the faint aura of something unsaid, all gnawed at him. His obsession had not waned. In fact, it had intensified, twisting into a blend of desire, fear, and unease. He realized that the fantasy he had built so meticulously was fragile, a delicate structure at risk of shattering with one careless move. James' mind raced with scenarios, doubts, and what-ifs. Every small gesture by Lily now carried the weight of interpretation. A glance, a sigh, a delayed text. The cracks in the fantasy were becoming impossible to ignore, yet leaving was not an option. Desire, obsession, and fear had fused into a singular, overwhelming force that held him captive. As the night deepened, he knew he would need to confront these truths soon. He didn't know whether it would lead to revelation, confrontation, or disaster, but one thing was clear: the paradise he had imagined was fractured, and the tension between them would only grow. Tomorrow, he thought, would be the day when fantasy collided with reality, and nothing would ever be the same again. The evening air was thick with humidity as James Caldwell entered Lily's apartment, the golden glow of the setting sun spilling across the worn wooden floors. He had begun to notice the subtleties in her presence, the slight curl of her lips when she lied, the way she avoided certain questions, the faint but undeniable tension in her posture. Tonight, however, the space between them was charged with something more immediate: desire, curiosity, and the magnetic pull of forbidden closeness. Lily was waiting in the living room, her hair cascading over her shoulders, dressed casually but with an attention to detail that made James's pulse quicken. "I made some wine," she said softly, her eyes flickering toward him, holding both invitation and challenge. He stepped closer, inhaling the faint scent of her perfume, a mix of vanilla and something darker, almost metallic. Their eyes met, and for a moment, words were unnecessary. He could feel the tension, thick and electric, wrapping around him. They talked, but conversation was minimal. Instead, they lingered on gestures, shared glances, and the brush of hands. Lily leaned in close, whispering about her day, but carefully, almost teasingly, leaving gaps in her story. James noticed them immediately, the omitted details, the subtle deflection when he probed gently. There was a rhythm to her revelations, a deliberate drip of information designed to enthrall without fully revealing. Desire mixed with unease, creating a heady cocktail that left him both intoxicated and wary. When the conversation gave way to touch, James followed, unable to resist the gravitational pull of her presence. Their intimacy was a dance, both physical and psychological, layers of trust, seduction, and manipulation intertwined. He noticed the faint scars along her wrist and the way she tensed when he brushed against them, yet he didn't ask. Desire overrode reason, and the boundaries between curiosity and obsession blurred. Each whispered word, each shared breath, was another thread in the complex tapestry of their connection. Yet even in these moments of closeness, subtle warning signs gnawed at him. Lily laughed lightly, yet it didn't reach her eyes. Her phone buzzed insistently on the side table, and she flinched before quickly dismissing it. James caught himself noting these details obsessively, cataloging each irregularity, each subtle hesitation, each hidden fragment of truth. He knew this was dangerous, that the fantasy he had constructed was slipping, but he wouldn't, let go. Later, as they lay entwined on the couch, James felt the sharp edge of realization cut through the haze of desire. Lily was not merely evasive, she was guarded, calculating, a living puzzle that both terrified and fascinated him. He wanted to uncover her secrets, to possess not just her body but the truth behind the eyes that seemed to change with every glance. But every attempt at understanding only made him more entangled, more dependent on the very uncertainty that frustrated him. By midnight, the apartment had grown still, shadows stretching along the walls, a quiet reminder of the world outside their cocoon. James stared at Lily's profile, memorizing the curve of her cheek, the subtle rise and fall of her chest with each breath. In that intimate darkness, he realized something unsettling. Desire had morphed into something more dangerous. It was no longer just attraction or obsession. It was a compulsion that demanded control, understanding, and revelation. As he finally stood to leave the room, careful not to disturb her, James understood that the moments of closeness had shifted the balance between them. Lily's secrets were no longer trivial curiosities. They were the pulse of tension that would shape everything to come. Tomorrow would test him, his desires, and his limits. He knew he was already on the edge, teetering between fantasy and the creeping shadows of something darker, something inevitable. The night closed in, and James remained awake long after, replaying every word, every touch, every hidden glance. Secrets had been exchanged, yet none fully revealed, and the quiet realization settled deep in his mind. The fantasy was no longer intact, and the tension between them was only beginning to unravel. James Caldwell awoke to the faint hum of the air conditioner, Florida's humid heat pressing against his skin. Even in the early morning light, the apartment felt heavy, suffused with a tension he couldn't yet name. Lily was already awake, moving quietly in the kitchen, the soft clink of utensils breaking the silence. James watched her from the doorway, noticing things he had previously overlooked: the slight pallor in her skin, the faint discoloration beneath her nails, and the subtle odor that lingered in the room. Something was off, but he wouldn't admit it to himself. He tried to shake the unease with small talk, asking about her plans for the day. Lily answered lightly, her voice casual, but her eyes darted toward the window with a nervous quickness. James noticed the twitch of her fingers as she wiped the counter, the forced cheer in her laugh, and the way she carefully avoided mentioning any friends or past events. Each small detail gnawed at him, though he rationalized them as quirks, as remnants of her guarded personality he had admired before. Yet the gnawing suspicion persisted, unshakable, like a shadow he could feel but not see. They went for a walk along the boardwalk, the sun glaring off the water, children laughing nearby, tourists snapping photos with ignorant joy. James tried to focus on the scene, on the warmth of Lily's hand brushing against his, but something in her behavior kept pulling him back into doubt. She flinched when a stranger walked past too closely, laughed too loudly at a passerby's joke, and at one point, glanced at a nearby alley with a flicker of unease that she quickly masked. His mind catalogued these moments obsessively, weaving patterns that may or may not have existed. Back at the apartment, James noticed subtle, unsettling details: the faint stain on the edge of the bathtub, the sticky residue on the kitchen counter, and the way Lily avoided sitting in certain chairs. His stomach churned with a mix of fear, fascination, and the obsessive curiosity that had brought him across states. He couldn't stop himself from probing gently, asking innocuous questions about her health and habits, but each answer felt rehearsed, deflective. Lily's smile remained, but there was a flicker, an almost imperceptible warning hidden behind her gaze. That night, they shared a quiet dinner. The candlelight flickered across her face, highlighting the tension behind her eyes. She laughed lightly at something he said, yet he felt it was hollow, a performance to mask whatever lay beneath. James wrestled with his impulses, to trust her, to confront her, or to leave. Desire warred with fear, obsession with reason, leaving him mentally exhausted, trapped in the cage of his own compulsion. Later, alone in his room, he replayed every moment, dissecting her gestures, words, and silences. The apartment felt smaller now, more claustrophobic. Shadows seemed to stretch along the walls, the faint odor lingering, prickling his skin. Something unspoken hovered in the air, a tension neither had acknowledged aloud. He knew the cracks in their fragile connection were widening, and the warning signs were no longer subtle, they were impossible to ignore. James felt a strange thrill in the unease, a dangerous mix of fear and desire. Each warning sign made him want to understand her more, to penetrate the mysteries she kept hidden. Yet the more he observed, the more he realized that knowledge could bring both clarity and horror. He lay awake long after Lily had fallen asleep, cataloging every sign, every flicker, every unspoken secret. By the time the streetlights outside flickered on, casting long shadows into the apartment, James understood a grim truth. The paradise he had imagined was not what he had found. Instead, he had entered a world of tension, uncertainty, and unspoken danger. Tomorrow would demand decisions, small choices that might unravel everything and one day, perhaps, reveal the full consequences of desire, obsession, and what he could no longer ignore. The warning signs had arrived, and with them, the first whispers of impending darkness. James Caldwell woke to a heavy, suffocating silence that pressed against his chest like a physical weight. The Florida sun had barely risen, but the apartment already felt oppressive. The warning signs he had noticed yesterday had not faded. Instead, they seemed to multiply in his mind. He tried to rationalize the unease. Maybe it was stress, the unfamiliar surroundings, or the intensity of obsession, but a darker, unspoken fear had taken root, gnawing at his thoughts with relentless persistence. He stepped into the bathroom, the tile cold beneath his feet. Lily had already left the room, leaving only a faint trace of perfume and the echo of her presence. As James approached the sink, he noticed a subtle but unmistakable detail, something that made his stomach twist violently. There, in the pale light, was a sight that shattered his carefully constructed reality. A small cluster of maggots wriggling near a wound he had not noticed before. Panic gripped him, hot and suffocating, as disbelief battled with revulsion. His mind recoiled from the horror, yet fascination, a dangerous, obsessive fascination, kept him rooted to the spot. He blinked rapidly, trying to process what he saw. The maggots moved slowly, grotesquely, a reminder of decay and mortality that no fantasy could mask. Every thought he had built about desire, intimacy, and connection collapsed in an instant, replaced by a raw, animalistic reaction, fear, disgust, and an uncontrollable urge to act. For a brief, terrifying moment, he considered leaving immediately, running from the apartment and the nightmare he had stumbled into. But obsession, his unyielding, overpowering obsession, refused to let him go. Lily returned before he could move. She carried herself with a casualness that made the horror even more surreal. "Morning," she said, her smile as if nothing were wrong. James wanted to scream, to demand answers, to confront her, but words failed him. The image of the maggots burned behind his eyes, a grotesque memory that refused to be suppressed. His voice came out as a strained, half-choked whisper. What is that?" Lily's expression flickered, a brief hesitation before her usual composure returned. "Oh, that," she said lightly, brushing past him to clean the counter. "It's nothing. Just a little issue. Don't worry about it." The casual dismissal, the way she deflected, pushed James closer to the edge. His mind spun, seeking logic, explanation, reason, anything that could soothe the horror, but none came. The day passed in a haze of tension. James moved like a ghost through the apartment, unable to focus on anything but the grotesque image that haunted him. Every glance at Lily, every casual movement, now carried weight, meaning, and the possibility of deception. He began cataloging every inconsistency with meticulous obsession, the way she avoided certain areas, the way she flinched at innocuous sounds, the faint odor that lingered in corners. Horror had become a microscope under which he dissected her presence, searching for answers, for control, for some semblance of clarity. By nightfall, his mind teetered on the brink. The apartment, once a warm cocoon of desire, had transformed into a theater of dread. Shadows stretched across the walls, flickering in the dim lamplight, their shapes twisting into grotesque visions. Every sound, the distant hum of traffic, the occasional creak of the building settling, felt amplified, menacing, conspiratorial. James stared at Lily across the room, the distance between them charged with unspoken terror. The fantasy that had drawn him here had collapsed entirely, leaving raw obsession and fear in its wake. He understood, with a cold, chilling clarity, that the delicate balance between desire and horror had shattered. And in that fracture, a dangerous, uncontrollable impulse began to emerge, threatening to eclipse reason entirely. As he lay awake that night, heart pounding and palms clammy, James realized the inevitable truth. The descent into horror had begun, and there would be no turning back. Tomorrow would test him, his limits, and the fragile line separating obsession from violence. The shadow of what he had seen, and what he might do, loomed over him, unrelenting and inevitable. James Caldwell paced the narrow confines of Lily's apartment, his thoughts a chaotic swirl of revulsion, desire, and mounting rage. The image of the maggots lingered in his mind, writhing grotesquely, a visceral reminder that the fantasy he had carried across states was collapsing. Every careful narrative he had constructed about their intimacy now seemed fragile, brittle, and utterly meaningless. He could no longer reconcile the woman he had imagined with the reality before him. Lily entered the room quietly, holding a glass of wine, her expression calm as though nothing had changed. "You're tense," she remarked casually, setting the glass on the coffee table. Her words struck James like a blade. Controlled, untouched by the chaos that consumed him. He opened his mouth to speak, to demand explanations, but hesitation stalled him. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to confront her, yet he feared the consequences of doing so. Finally he spoke, voice low, trembling. "Lily, what is going on? What's happening with you?" The words sounded weak even to his own ears, but they carried the weight of desperation, of a man teetering on the edge of his own moral limits. Lily's gaze met his, unflinching, and for the first time, he noticed the subtle smirk playing at the corner of her lips. It was as if she had anticipated this confrontation, as if his horror was a performance written for her amusement. She sipped her wine, deliberately slow, eyes never leaving his. "What do you mean?" she asked softly, the lightness in her tone a mockery of innocence. James felt the walls close in, the apartment shrinking until it was no more than a cage of fear, obsession, and desire. Every evasive word, every deflection, stoked the fire in his mind. The boundaries of reason began to blur. He could feel his pulse hammering in his temples, a physical manifestation of the tension that had been building since his arrival. James stepped closer, unable to resist the magnetic pull of confrontation. "You can't just pretend nothing's wrong," he shouted, the words tearing out of him with unrestrained force. His eyes searched hers for truth, for honesty, for even a sliver of the woman he had loved from afar. Instead, he found amusement, deflection, and a haunting, dangerous calm that sent shivers down his spine. The room felt charged, alive with electric tension. Shadows shifted with the flicker of the overhead light, mirroring the chaotic pulse of his thoughts. James' mind raced, calculating, imagining, spiraling. What had been attraction, then obsession, now teetered on the precipice of violence. The desire to control, to understand, to dominate collided violently with revulsion and fear, leaving him raw, unsteady, and dangerous. Lily's smile widened just slightly, an imperceptible tilt of her head that seemed to mock his internal struggle. James felt an instinctual, visceral impulse flare within him, a need to act, to impose order on the chaos, to regain control over the nightmare that had become his reality. He realized with a cold, terrifying clarity that the equilibrium had shattered. The fantasy, the obsession, the careful balance between love and horror, it was all gone. For a moment, silence fell, broken only by the faint hum of the air conditioner and their ragged breathing. James' chest heaved as he grappled with the immensity of what had been revealed, what had been hidden, and what might yet occur. Every warning sign, every subtle clue, every ounce of foreboding had led him to this point. He backed away slowly, mind calculating, body tense, knowing instinctively that nothing would be the same. Tomorrow, he realized, would demand a reckoning, not just for Lily, but for himself. The line between desire and destruction had been crossed, and there was no turning back. The apartment, once a sanctuary of fantasy and desire, had become a crucible of tension, fear, and impending consequences. James understood that the breaking point had arrived, and with it, the first irreversible steps toward the darkness awaiting him. James Caldwell stood frozen in the dimly lit apartment, the metallic tang of blood sharp and overwhelming in his nostrils. The room, once filled with the warm glow of desire, now reeked of horror. Shadows stretched across the walls, twisting with the flickering overhead light, echoing the chaos that had erupted moments before. His hands, still trembling, bore the evidence of actions he couldn't undo, actions that had turned obsession into irreversible reality. He staggered toward the kitchen counter, leaning heavily as if the weight of his own conscience had grown physical. Memories of the confrontation with Lily replayed in his mind, every word, every glance, every subtle deflection that had pushed him past the edge. He couldn't stop thinking about her calm, unflinching expression, the way she had laughed at the tension he had carried across the state, unaware or uncaring of the storm he had brought into her life. That smile now haunted him, a ghost entwined with the scent of copper and fear. The apartment was silent except for the faint hum of the air conditioner and the occasional creak of the old building settling. James moved carefully, cataloging the aftermath with obsessive precision. The sheets were stained, the carpet darkened in places he could hardly bear to look, and the faint, lingering odor of decay had seeped into the corners of the room. Every detail screamed of consequences, a relentless reminder that there was no undoing what had been done. James' mind flickered between panic and rationalization. He tried to construct a story, an explanation, a justification that could make sense of the horror. Every instinct in his body screamed to flee, to erase the evidence, to reclaim some semblance of control, but fear clashed with obsession, leaving him trapped in a liminal space between reason and madness. He wiped his hands on a towel, only to recoil at the blood that still stained his fingers, stubborn and unforgiving. Hours passed in a distorted haze. James moved with a methodical, almost ritualistic precision, cleaning, hiding, cataloging every trace of what had occurred. Each motion, though practical, was punctuated by flashes of memory. Lily's eyes, wide with disbelief, her soft, incredulous voice pleading and laughing at the same time. The grotesque, wriggling proof of decay he had discovered days before. His obsession, now fused with terror and guilt, refused to be quieted. It demanded attention, calculation, and reflection, a cruel echo of the fantasy he had carried across states. By nightfall, James found himself sitting on the couch, staring blankly at the city lights flickering through the windows. The apartment, once a sanctuary of desire, had been transformed into a theater of his own psychological torment. Shadows danced on the walls as though mocking him, flickering shapes that mirrored the fragmented pieces of his mind. He couldn't sleep, he couldn't think without being pulled back into the horror. Every detail, every nuance of Lily's presence and absence, pressed against him with a relentless weight. He thought of the outside world, of neighbors who might notice, of friends who might wonder, of the authorities who could arrive at any moment. The paranoia was suffocating. Each noise, the distant honk of a car, the faint bark of a dog, the occasional siren, felt amplified, intrusive, threatening. He imagined their curiosity, their questions, their judgment. And he understood, with a stark clarity that chilled him to the bone, that nothing would ever be the same again. As he sank further into the dark silence of the apartment, James realized that the aftermath of blood was not just physical. It was psychological, existential. It had transformed him, fractured him, leaving him raw, obsessive, and dangerously aware of the delicate line between control and chaos. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, perhaps discovery, perhaps confrontation, But tonight, he remained suspended in the crushing weight of his own mind. The city outside continued its indifferent hum, oblivious to the horrors unfolding within the apartment. James, seated amidst shadows and lingering dread, understood that this was only the beginning. The repercussions of his actions would ripple outward, touching lives, distorting truths, and setting in motion events beyond his control. The blood had been shed, and now he had to live with what it demanded. James Caldwell sat in the dim glow of the apartment, the remnants of the previous night still heavy in the air. He tried to convince himself that the world outside remained oblivious, that no one would ever suspect the chaos he had left behind. But a faint, nagging unease had begun to gnaw at him, whispering of consequences, of eyes watching, of a world that demanded accountability. The first knock at the door was light, tentative. James froze, the blood still cold beneath his fingernails, his pulse thrumming in his ears. He held his breath, waiting. Another knock, louder this time. Heart-hammering, he approached the peephole, peering through the small glass lens. A uniformed officer stood outside, clipboard in hand, a polite but firm expression marking his features. "Mr. Caldwell?" the officer asked. James' mind raced. Was this about a routine complaint? A neighbor's noise? No, the subtle tension in the man's posture, the watchful eyes, the way he scanned the hallway, something more significant had arrived. His hands clenched into fists. "Yes," he replied, voice measured despite the adrenaline surging through him. The officer explained they were following up on a report, a missing person, recently filed, whose last known contact was here in Florida. Every word cut deeper than the metallic scent of blood still lingering in James' apartment. Questions were asked, answers demanded. James responded cautiously, offering small truths, careful omissions. He could feel the invisible thread of scrutiny tightening, a net slowly drawing closed. As the officer left, James slumped against the wall, the weight of observation pressing on him. The apartment, once a cocoon of private obsession, had transformed into a stage under unseen eyes. He catalogued every possible witness, every potential detail that could expose him. Each shadow, each passing figure outside the window, became a threat, a possible link in a chain that could unravel everything. He began noticing subtle changes in the city itself. Police cars that lingered longer than usual, unfamiliar patrols circling the block, neighbors who glanced too often in his direction. James' paranoia intensified. Every creak in the floorboards, every honk of a distant horn, every muted conversation outside felt magnified, evidence that he was no longer in control. The obsession that had guided his actions now turned inward, devouring him with relentless precision. Messages from acquaintances reached him, calls he avoided, emails he ignored, yet all of them formed a network of connections he could no longer dismiss. The walls seemed to close in, the air thick with the collective weight of suspicion. James realized that the investigation was not just external. It had permeated his psyche, transforming every thought, every movement, every heartbeat into a potential misstep. By evening, he found himself pacing the apartment, restless and exhausted. Shadows from the streetlights outside stretched along the walls like dark fingers, creeping toward him with every flicker. The silence was punctuated by faint sirens in the distance, the city humming with an indifferent rhythm that mocked his growing desperation. He knew, with absolute clarity, that the investigation was closing in, that time was slipping, and that the line between freedom and capture had narrowed dangerously. James' obsession had always been inward, a private frenzy of desire and control. Now, the external pressure, the law, scrutiny, consequence, pushed him into a new realm of psychological strain. Every decision, every glance at the window, every attempt at composure, became a delicate negotiation between self-preservation and unraveling. He was no longer merely obsessed. He was hunted by the invisible eyes of justice, and the walls of his fantasy were crumbling faster than he could repair them. As night settled over the city, James understood the grim inevitability. The investigation would not be denied, ignored, or evaded forever. The consequences of obsession, desire, and horror were converging, and the moment of reckoning was approaching. He could feel it in the air, in the shadows, in the sharp, tense rhythm of his own heartbeat. Tomorrow, he knew, would demand answers, and nothing would remain the same. James Caldwell sat on the edge of the couch, the apartment dim and oppressive around him. The city outside continued its indifferent hum, oblivious to the storm that had consumed his life within these walls. Every shadow, every flicker of light, seemed to echo the tension building in his mind. The investigation, the horror, and the obsession had converged into a single, inescapable weight pressing against him. He had to confront everything, Lily, himself, and the consequences of what had been unleashed. Lily appeared in the doorway, her expression calm, almost serene, a stark contrast to the chaos inside James' mind. She carried herself with the same air of confidence he had noticed from the beginning, yet tonight there was a subtle vulnerability he hadn't seen before. "James," she said softly, her voice carrying a weight of unsaid truths, "we need to talk." The words, simple as they were, struck him like a hammer. He nodded, unable to speak, his pulse quickening as dread and curiosity intertwined. They sat together, the space between them charged with unspoken tension. James' thoughts raced, cataloging every subtle flicker in her expression, every pause, every hesitation. He wanted explanations, confessions, some way to piece together the nightmare he had stumbled into. The image of the maggots, the stains, the chaos, all demanded answers, but more than that, he wanted the fragile control he had lost restored. Finally, Lily spoke. "There's a lot you don't know," she said, her tone almost conspiratorial. "I haven't been entirely honest with you. About myself, my past, everything that led to this moment." James leaned forward, eyes wide, gripping the edge of the couch as though holding on physically could anchor him to reality. "What are you talking about?" he whispered, the edge of hysteria creeping into his voice. She took a deep breath, revealing fragments of her life he hadn't imagined. Her struggles, the relationships she had hidden, the secrets she had cultivated carefully over time. Each revelation was a shard of truth, sharp and painful, cutting into the fantasy he had carried with him across states. Yet there was more than truth in her confession. There was manipulation, there was control, there was the careful construction of a world meant to entice, to ensnare, to test him. James' mind raced to process it all, every piece intertwining with fear, anger, and desire. "I never meant for it to go this far," Lily admitted finally, her voice trembling slightly, betraying the cracks beneath her composed surface. "But now, you need to understand why, and I can't hide it anymore." James felt a strange mix of relief and dread. Relief that the lies were being exposed, dread for the magnitude of what had been hidden. Every instinct in him screamed both to forgive and to punish, to accept and to reject. He found himself speaking, confessing the darkest recesses of his own mind. His obsession, his compulsion, the thoughts that had driven him to Florida and into this spiraling nightmare. The words poured out like blood from an open wound, raw, unfiltered, impossible to contain. Every confession brought him closer to understanding, and simultaneously closer to losing the last fragments of control he had clung to. In the dim light, as their confessions intertwined, James understood a terrible, chilling truth. The line between victim and perpetrator, between desire and horror, had dissolved entirely. They were both complicit, both ensnared in a web of obsession, secrets, and revelation that neither could escape. The weight of what had been done, and what had been revealed, pressed down on him, suffocating yet intoxicating. As the night deepened, silence fell between them, heavy and full of meaning. Neither could turn back. Neither could reclaim the fantasy that had begun this descent. The confessions had revealed the truth, but with it came the realization that nothing would ever be the same. They were bound together by obsession, horror, and revelation, and the consequences of their entanglement would ripple outward, unstoppable, inevitable. James leaned back, heart hammering, and stared at Lily. The room, the shadows, the hum of the city, all seemed suspended in this moment, teetering between confession and calamity. He knew that tomorrow, the consequences of what had been revealed would demand action, judgment, and perhaps finality. The revelations were complete, the confessions made, and the fragile remnants of their world hung by a thread. The morning light filtered through the blinds, sharp and unforgiving, casting stripes across the apartment floor. James Caldwell sat on the couch, still hollowed from the confessions shared the night before. The weight of revelation pressed against him, heavy as lead. Outside, the city moved on obliviously, unaware that behind these walls, obsession and horror had collided, leaving fragments of innocence shattered and lives irreparably changed. The knock at the door was brisk, commanding attention. James froze, a familiar tension clawing at his chest. Through the peephole, he saw uniformed officers, badges gleaming, notebooks in hand. The investigation had arrived, its inevitability finally manifesting. The threads he had tried to contain, ignore, or rationalize were closing in, and there was no escaping the consequences. "Mr. Caldwell," one officer began, voice calm yet firm, "we need to ask you a few questions regarding a missing person report. You were the last known contact." James' mouth went dry. Each carefully constructed narrative, every omission, every lie that had guided him through days of obsession, now teetered on the brink of exposure. He nodded slowly, masking panic with mechanical composure, and allowed them inside. The apartment, once a haven of desire and intimate chaos, now felt like a courtroom. Every corner seemed to harbor evidence, every shadow whispered accusation. James answered questions cautiously, offering selective truths, aware that his tone, gestures, and silences were all under scrutiny. The officers moved with precision, cataloging details, observing reactions, their presence a mirror of the law's inexorable reach. As they questioned him, James' mind replayed the moments that had led here, the fantasy of desire, the obsessive pursuit, the horrifying discoveries, and the confessions exchanged. Each memory was sharp, a relentless reminder that actions have consequences beyond imagination, beyond control. He realized, perhaps too late, that obsession is a predator of its own making, leaving no room for escape once it has consumed you. Hours passed. The officers left with careful instructions, leaving James alone with the residual tension that had settled like dust over the apartment. He wandered from room to room, each space a repository of memory and dread. Shadows stretched along the walls, bending with the flickering lamplight, each one a specter of the past he could not undo. He touched the countertops, the couch, the edge of the bed, as if by doing so he could absorb or erase the gravity of what had occurred. He found himself standing by the window, looking out at the street below. People moved about their lives, laughing, arguing, oblivious to the devastation that had transpired mere floors above. Justice, he realized, was now an external force, inexorable and unavoidable. The shadows that haunted him were not merely psychological, they were the weight of accountability, the imprint of actions that demanded recognition. In the quiet that followed, James considered the cost of truth. Desire, obsession, and horror had intertwined, leaving no clear victor. Lily, James, and the fractured remnants of their world were bound together by acts that could neither be erased nor forgiven. Justice, when it came, would not erase the memories, the fear, or the darkness that had been unleashed. The consequences were larger than any one person, more complex than simple punishment. As night fell, James sat once more in the dim light, the hum of the city a low, constant pulse. He understood that the investigation was just one piece of the aftermath. The true reckoning was internal. Guilt, fear, and the knowledge of what he had become were his companions, shadows that would follow relentlessly, even if the law moved on. The world outside might carry on, but inside, the echoes of obsession and horror would never fade. The apartment was silent now, except for his own ragged breathing. James knew that justice had arrived in both external and internal forms, and that the shadows of his choices would shape the remainder of his existence. There was no absolution, no return to innocence, only the ongoing reckoning, the unrelenting presence of consequences that demanded acknowledgement. The apartment was silent, a heavy, oppressive quiet that pressed against James Caldwell's chest like a living thing. The city outside continued its indifferent rhythm, but inside, time had slowed, stretched thin by tension, obsession, and the weight of consequence. Every corner, every shadow, seemed alive with memory, the echo of whispers, confessions, and irreversible choices. James moved through the space with slow, deliberate steps, as if any sudden motion might shatter the fragile boundary between sanity and despair. The investigation had ended, at least officially. Officers had come, taken notes, asked questions, and left. But their departure did not bring relief. It brought emptiness, a hollow confirmation that the consequences of his actions would linger, unyielding and unforgiving. James knew that justice, in its procedural sense, had been served, yet the internal reckoning, the moral and psychological price, was far from over. He wandered to the living room, staring at the remnants of their shared existence. Furniture bore stains of a night that could never be erased. The faint, lingering odor of decay seemed to hang in the air like a silent accusation. Each object, each piece of evidence, was a reminder of the trajectory that desire and obsession had taken, and of the darkness now embedded in his own soul. He could almost hear Lily's voice, gentle and defiant, echoing through the shadows. A reminder of secrets revealed and confessions made, impossible to retract. James sank into the couch, hands trembling as he replayed every detail of the past days. The city lights outside flickered through the blinds, casting long, distorted shadows that mirrored the fracture lines of his mind. He realized that the fantasy, the obsession, the pursuit that had driven him here, had left him irrevocably altered. Nothing could return him to the man he had been before, nor restore the innocence that had been lost in the pursuit of desire, horror, and revelation. He thought about the consequences that stretched beyond the apartment, beyond his mind. Friends, acquaintances, authorities, all had played roles in the unfolding drama, yet none could fully grasp the psychological weight he now carried. Even if the world moved on, James knew he could not. Every moment, every memory, was a thread in the tapestry of obsession that would follow him relentlessly. By evening, the apartment had grown colder, shadows stretching like fingers across the walls. James' reflection in the window stared back at him, hollow-eyed, a man stripped bare of illusion. There was no redemption here, no absolution, only the slow, grinding understanding that actions, once taken, cannot be undone. He had crossed a line from which there was no return. The silence around him was not peaceful. It was judgmental, waiting, unrelenting. He sat with his head in his hands, heart still pounding from the intensity of confession, confrontation, and aftermath. Every sound outside, the distant hum of traffic, the occasional siren, seemed amplified, a reminder that the world continued without pause, indifferent to the horrors that had unfolded within these walls. Yet within him, time had stopped. The obsession that had begun in longing had ended in isolation, guilt, and the permanence of irrevocable acts. As night deepened, James understood one final, inescapable truth. The fantasy, the desire, the obsession had concluded, leaving only silence and shadows. There would be no undoing, no reconciliation, no restoration of what had been lost. The psychological consequences were eternal, a permanent residue of horror and compulsion that would never fade. He rose slowly, moving to the window once more, staring down at the city that went on oblivious. A long, shuddering breath escaped him. Outside, life continued. Inside, he remained suspended between memory and consequence, desire and horror, confession and guilt. The apartment, now a mausoleum of obsession, bore witness to the final silence. A silence that marked not only the end of events but the permanent imprint on the mind and soul of a man consumed by his own darkest impulses. James knew there was no closure, only the enduring presence of shadows within, the echo of revelations, and the haunting memory of actions that would define the rest of his existence. The final silence was not peace, it was reckoning, and it would never end.